Our preaching text today is Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. Good morning, church. This morning we hear a psalm of confidence, a psalm intended to make us all feel more secure. Instead of being consumed by worries, we're told our God neither slumbers nor sleeps. In other words, God is always on the job, doing what God does. Is this not what we all wish for from God? We want to feel ourselves protected. We want God to be always on the lookout for us and those close to us. Sisters and brothers, is this not what we hope for, what we desire? Do we not all want to have God on our side? Do we not all want God to be our champion as we face the many challenges life presents us? Do we not all want God to be so in love with us that God will never allow anything bad to happen to us? This is what we all wish. But we also know that bad things really do happen to good people. We only need to look at the recent devastation in Japan. And as I look out this morning on our congregation, and as we heard during our joys and concerns, I know a few of the tragedies that have stricken our members. Yet I know but a tiny fraction of the suffering that has come upon us collectively. Life can be hard. Life can be disappointing. Life can be painful. Life can be tragic. We have all learned these truths. And when I imagine all the people who've worshipped over the many years this sanctuary has stood, I see in my mind's eye a vast array of troubles and turmoil. I see this sanctuary piled high with a large assortment of broken hearts. Is this not so, church? Has this sanctuary not witnessed too many untimely memorial services? Too many tragedies? This sanctuary is sacred because of all who have worshipped here, all who have prayed here, all who have sought God here. This sanctuary is also sacred because of the suffering endured by those who have come here to Morgan Park Baptist Church in search of the solace of the Almighty. Is this not so? So, what are we to make of the suffering endured by those who believe mightily in God? What are we to make of the suffering endured by those who walk devoutly as a disciple of Jesus Christ? There are no easy answers here. Surely we don't respond in the same way as the so-called friends of Job, who kept insisting that Job's trials and tribulations were a punishment from God because of his sins. We no longer see the advent of bad times, the blows of capricious fate, as a chastisement from the divine. God neither slumbers nor sleeps. But God also doesn't spend time rewarding some people and punishing others. This is not how God works. Brothers and sisters, let me state this clearly. Anyone who believes in a God who punishes people in this life because of sin has an unhealthy and unwell view of the nature of God. And I say this primarily because of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Christ absolutely puts to an end any and every notion of suffering as a punishment from the Almighty. As the French poet Paul Claudel phrased it, Jesus did not come to remove suffering or to explain it away. He came to fill it with his presence. Listen also, church, to this reflection from Matt Gunter, the rector of the Episcopalian Church of St. Barnabas in Glen Ellen. He writes, "In Jesus Christ, God enters into the mess we humans have made of the world. On the cross, God in Christ takes on the pain and the suffering of the world. The world's passion, the world's suffering becomes Christ's passion, Christ's suffering. And God transforms that passion and suffering into the promise of resurrection. By his wounds we will be healed. And so will be the rest of creation, which eagerly awaits being set free from its bondage to futility and decay." In other words, the answer to the suffering and evil of our world is not that God can't do anything about it. The answer to the problem of suffering and evil is evident. Jesus Christ is God's answer to the perpetual problem of suffering and evil. There can be no other trustworthy answer. Sisters and brothers, I find it profoundly difficult being around believers who try to use God as a battering ram against anyone. There are too many Christians who misunderstand the message of the cross of Christ. There are too many Christians who try to use the cross of Christ as a weapon against those who do not believe as they believe. But to act in this way merits the only word I find capable of describing this behavior: sacrilege. It is the misuse of the sacred cross of Christ for unholy purposes. Church, let's explore this problem a bit further. Listen to this material from How God Changes Your Brain. Breakthrough findings from a leading neuroscientist. In essence, we all have two brains. One selfish and suspicious, another open-minded and kind. Since we live in a world filled with uncertainties, both brains are constantly on the alert. The authors, Andrew Newberg and Mark Waldman, tell this familiar story, which you may have heard before. Once upon a time, or so the Cherokee legend goes, a young Indian boy received a beautiful drum as a gift. When his best friend saw it, he asked if he could play with it. But the boy felt torn. He didn't want to share his new present, so he angrily told his friend, "No." His friend ran away, and the boy sat down on a rock by the stream to contemplate his dilemma. He hated the fact that he had hurt his friend's feelings. But the drum was too precious to share. So in his quandary, he went to his grandfather for advice. The elder listened quietly to the story and then replied, "I often feel as though there are two wolves fighting inside of me. One is mean and greedy and full of arrogance and pride, but the other is peaceful and generous. All the time, these wolves are struggling. And you, my boy, have those same two wolves inside of you. Which one will win?" asked the boy. The grandfather smiled and said, "The one you feed." The authors go on to state, we all harbor a pack of neurological wolves in our brain. The old ones reside in the brain's limbic system, and they are filled with aggression and fear. They're fast, efficient, and potentially deadly, and they've been running the show for 150 million years. The younger ones reside in our brain's frontal lobes, an anterior cingulate, where empathy, reason, logic, and compassion reside. Now, what this means, brothers and sisters, is that we must always be careful which of our interior wolves we feed. If we feed the older, more aggressive wolf, we not only stray from true Christianity, but we can actually suffer brain damage. As Newberg and Waldman argue, if you allow anger and fear to dominate, you will lose the neurological ability to think logically and to act compassionately toward others. In fact, it is nearly impossible to find peace and serenity if your mind is preoccupied by negative, anxious, or hateful thoughts. They go on. Excessive anger or fear can permanently disrupt many structures and functions in both your body and your brain. These destructive emotions interfere with memory storage and cognitive accuracy, which in turn will disrupt our ability to properly evaluate and respond in social situations. Anger makes people indiscriminately punitive, blameful, pessimistic, and unilaterally careless in their logic and reasoning skills. And furthermore, anger encourages your brain to defend your beliefs, be they right or wrong. And when this happens, you'll be more likely to feel prejudice toward others. You'll inaccurately perceive anger in other people's faces, and this will increase your own distrust and fear. It's an insidious process that feeds on itself. Eventually, it will even damage important structures in your brain. I mention all this, church, because we all struggle with the wolves living within our brains. I believe this is what St. Paul was speaking about when he writes in Romans chapter 7, verse 16, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate." We too face such dilemmas like St. Paul. And if we allow fear and anger to overtake us, then the wolf of aggression, the wolf of prejudice, the wolf of racism, the wolf of intolerance will grow big and strong. And then the wolf of kindness and compassion, the wolf of Christian charity and tolerance, will be no match for its longtime adversary. And brothers and sisters, when the wolf of anger and aggression wins out, we wind up with intolerant Christians. We wind up with so-called Christians picketing military funerals with hateful signs. We wind up with Christians incapable of dialogue. We wind up with Christians claiming to be the only true Christians. We wind up with Christians damning to hellfire this group or that group. We wind up with Christians claiming natural disasters to be punishments from God. Sisters and brothers, I feel sorrow for these people. We should pray for them on a regular basis. Their intolerance, their arrogance, their prejudice results from feeding the wrong wolf, the selfish side of the brain. So what are we to do? How do we become the people God created us to become? How do we become the disciples Jesus Christ calls us to become? Newberg and Waldman contend, is there something more definitive we can do to tame our selfish brain? They write, neurologically, the answer is surprisingly simple. Because all we need to do is consciously exercise kindness and fairness toward others. As many studies have shown, the more compassionate we become, the more generous those around us become. And when we perceive others as being sensitive to our needs, our brains respond with greater generosity, a condition known as reciprocal altruism. Thus, when we treat others with kindness and respect, even those who hold different beliefs will respond in kind. And many studies have demonstrated that the more friendly contact you have with members of different religions, or cultural groups, ethnic groups, or racial groups, the less prejudice you will harbor in your brain. Sisters and brothers, we are called through the cross of Christ to tolerance, kindness, and compassion. We cannot allow the suffering of our world to have the final word. We cannot allow the wolf of fear and anger to have the final word. We cannot allow religious and racial prejudice to continue assaulting this planet on which we all live. Maybe it's time for some of us to go and pray with our Muslim brothers and sisters some Friday at the Mosque Foundation near 93rd and Harlem. Maybe it's time for some of us to go and pray with our Jewish sisters and brothers some Saturday at a synagogue in Hyde Park. Now, I bring these suggestions to us, church, to say that we can do better. We can feed only the wolf of kindness and compassion. We can grow in tolerance and fairness. We can grow in peace and harmony. And when we do this, church, when we do this, we will indeed rejoice in the fact that our God neither slumbers nor sleeps. God is always doing what God does best, loving us and calling us to a deeper life within the effervescent reality of God's omnipotent and never-ending passion and love for us. God so loved the world, sisters and brothers. God so loved the world. Amen.